Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the panel today. We have a great panel. My name is Maria Liakata. I'm a professor in natural language processing and a Turing AI fellow. And in recent years, I've been particularly interested in applications of language technology to mental health. And very relevant to this panel and the conference, I have a 5-year fellowship to develop methods for creating sensors from individuals' language, both in social media and in one-to-one conversations, and other heterogeneous digital content that people produce in order to understand, develop models that can understand changes in people's behavior over time. And we're particularly focusing on mental health. And we're interested in capturing moments of change in individuals, and how we find the ground truth for such moments of change is actually a focal point of our current work. And as ground truth will be featuring quite a lot in the discussion on this panel, I should say that what we mean by ground truth is known, verified information that we can base any modeling and assessments on. So our panel consists of experts who work at the intersection of language technology and mental health, as well as having with us a psychology expert. And we'd like to explore these issues around ground truth and other challenges in monitoring and diagnosing using user-generated content. So without much ado, I'd like to introduce I'd like to welcome our first panelist, who is Lucia Chen, a PhD student at Edinburgh. So Lucia, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to join this discussion today. I'm Lucia. I study informatics in University of Edinburgh. I worked in the Edinburgh NLP group. I use social media data to infer symptoms of mental illnesses, and I do moderations on forum discussions as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Lucia. So the next person is Nina Di Cara, who's also a PhD student at the University of Bristol. So over to you, Nina.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me here today. My name is Nina Di Cara, and as Maria said, I'm a PhD student at the University of Bristol, and I'm based in the medical school in the epidemiology unit. So previous to doing my PhD, I was a child protection social worker, where I worked with a lot of families and children who are experiencing poor mental health. And so I'm really interested in how we can model mental health using mathematics, which is the other part of my background. So my PhD largely focuses on collecting ground truth data from cohort studies, which is what our kind of lab research focus is at the moment, and also talking to participants about how they feel about their data being used for kind of ground truth purposes, and understanding the ethical boundaries of doing that kind of work with them. And yeah, as well as the kind of prediction side and machine learning side of that too.
Thank you very much, Nina. So our next panelist is Sumitra Vellupillai, who's a lecturer at King's College London and has a lot of experience in clinical NLP. So over to you, Sumitra.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks, and Becky, for inviting me to this panel. So yeah, I'm Sumitra. I'm a lecturer in applied health informatics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. And I also work at the NIHR Biomedical Research Center at the Maudsley. So my background is in NLP, language processing, but applied in the clinical domain. And I've worked in the mental health domain now for these years at King's. I work a lot also, not only on social media data, but also on electronic health record data. So in respect to the ground truth kind of theme, there's this element of other accounts around mental health that I've worked quite a lot on the last few years.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Sumitra. So next is Susie Godson, who's a psychologist and the co-founder of Me Too. And Susie, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? My name is Susie Godson. I'm co-founder of Me Too Education. Me Too is a mental health app for young people aged 11 to 25. It's based on the peer support model, but it's fully moderated. So every post and reply is checked by a human moderator. And the moderators also tag and risk assess all our data, which means that our data from 35,000 users is giving us incredible insights into youth mental health and how it changes over time.
Thank you very much, Susie. That's great. Last but not least, we have Bo Wang, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Oxford University and the Alan Turing Institute, and is working at the intersection of natural language processing and mental health. Bo?
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Bo Wang. Yes, so like Maria said, I'm currently a postdoc researcher in Oxford Psychiatry and Alan Turing Institute. I mainly work on extracting information from different modalities of data, such as language and speech, in order to model neuropsychiatric disorders such as bipolar disorder. So this includes interviews, so that's conversations, EHR, self-reports, as well as face emotions. I also have a PhD in NLP, where I was supervised by Maria today. Thank you.
Very much, Bo and everyone. So I'd like to start now by exploring some of these interesting issues around working with language data in the context of mental health. And I'd like to start by asking Lucia about her experience in developing ground truth labels from social media data, and the issues one should be aware of during this process, and how one should mitigate such issues. So looking forward to hearing Lucia.
Thank you for the question. Developing ground truth labels for social media data is a very difficult task, because what we have from social media data is like social media users tend to present themselves in a biased ways. So they tend to present a more positive message and less likely to present a negative message. So the signals we capture in social media data is biased. And in that way, like developing ground truth labels could be very noisy. So therefore, like how we interpret these labels is very important. Like it's important for us to be aware of that the information we retrieve from this data to develop the label is not complete. So we shouldn't see this as an absolute status, mental health status for the social media user. The ground truth label provide us some extra information of like the users, but we can't really see it as a status, mental health status for the user. So, but it's very good to have such a label, because that would help researchers to develop techniques to monitor some of the patterns, the mood patterns, or like some of the symptoms, behavior. So this is why this technology is very important in here. And also having these labels, it's there is a risk that like for malicious agents might use these labels to stigmatize a person. So in that case, it's very important for us to protect this data. So when we do this kind of research, it's important that data with such kind of label to be stored in a safe environment in which researchers can access this data, but it's not going to the public. So this is my opinion on this issue. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of biases inherent in assuming sort of that in making assumptions about the ground truth in these kinds of in sort of self-labeled data, and also when experts, well, we would have different kinds of experts annotating this data. But what are the dangers and the kind of biases that can be introduced?
Thank you. This is a very good question. A lot of the social media studies with using like social media data to infer the mental health status, we'll see they frame the question as a classification problem. So they would retrieve self-reported measurement scale, and then they will retrieve the label via the self measurement scale to see whether the person, for example, depressed or not. Now, this is a bit dangerous in a way, like it could create model biases, because if you see someone report themselves as depressed, and in the past, what we see in the model behavior is that some people, there were a few signals in social media data that could predict whether a person is having depressed symptom or not. So one is the mood pattern, and then is the posting time, whether the person tend to post at night or not, and the posting frequency, whether the person posts frequently or not, and the social network, how big the social network is, like do they have many followers, do they have many replies, do they have any influence in their social network. So there were a few this kind of cluster of symptoms, social media signals that can predict depression symptoms. But for people who reported have a high depression symptom score, and there were people who are moderately high and people who are severely high. So that makes, there's a difference in here. For people who are very depressed, they might not post anything. But what we found is people who are not depressed, they also post less. So then we see a pattern in here. If we observed the posting frequency, we'll see people post a lot, people post less. They have a similar pattern. For very depressed and they're not depressed, they have a similar pattern in posting frequency. In that case, when we use the machine learning models, there will be a noise in here because the data is biased towards something. So in terms of social network as well, for people, there's finding that people who are highly depressed, they have less influence in their social network. They tend to reply less. They tend to receive less replies. For people who are less depressed, like not depressed, they're also not very active on social media. So that's why they were like, we see like lots of these kind of noisy signals in social media and create model biases. If we use this model without knowing what are these biases, it could create group harm or stigmatization. So this is, so right now at this stage, I think we need to start to focus on like what are the biases in these signals and what are the interpretability of the models. Yes, this is my opinion.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll return to these issues as well later in the discussion. Let's now talk to Nina. And Nina, I think that you also have experience with social media data and sort of identifying ground truth, especially from longitudinal data. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on how our understanding of mental health can help us with identifying ground truth in such data and how to model it. So yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. It's something that I think about quite a lot when we're talking about how we label mental health, because the problem of what mental health actually is, I think, is a very interesting one. And as people who tend to be doing this kind of work, which tends to be mathematicians and computer scientists and statisticians, part of our job is to simplify something that's actually very complex into something that can be modelled. And that's part of our decision-making process when we're doing a kind of end-to-end from data with labels all the way up to making predictions on new data. And I think it's worth acknowledging that in that process we have quite a lot of power to decide what mental health is and what the labels of how mental health should be defined within that process. And also acknowledging that then the decisions that we've made on what mental health is impact the predictions that we're making on new data and how our algorithms might be used in the future to do all sorts of things, like as kind of Lucia also alluded to, if anyone could technically use algorithms potentially if they had access to them, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So yeah, in terms of what mental health is and how we model it, that could mean that we're making decisions about whether we want to use discrete classifications, so whether we want to say someone either has depression or they don't, and therefore we're going to have kind of a binary problem of yes, no, they do or do not have this characteristic in the data. Or we could be looking at it at a continuous kind of perspective and say, it almost like as a regression problem, and say, well, they answered a scale and the potential answers to that scale ranged between these numbers, and so we're going to try and decide where they are on that scale. And at some point maybe we choose a cutoff for, if you're over this score, then this probably means you have symptoms of depression. And all of those decisions are being made all the time in this modelling process, and I think depending on who is part of a research team and how the research is being conducted, different people are involved in making those decisions. So, for example, you could be a computer scientist who has collected social media data from for example, the Twitter API, labelled it all by yourself, and then run a machine learning model, and then use the data that you also labelled to decide how effective your model is. And within that process, there's a lot of room for maybe confusing examples of what depression is or isn't, and a lot more room for people like clinicians and also patients or people who have lived experience of mental health to kind of feed in and say, well, this is my understanding and my experience of what depression is, and this is what I think it would be useful to be able to predict if you wanted to be able to interpret the way I was feeling. So yeah, I could go on that for quite a long time, so I'll leave it there.
So I'd also like to hear your thoughts on the importance of the longitudinal data. So one thing that Lucia mentioned was that you have a pattern of people posting a lot or not posting much, and this could be either type of underlying condition. This could be this kind of posting behavior could represent either pattern of underlying condition, and so perhaps what we want is actually to identify the baseline of an individual. So I'd like you to tell me what your thoughts are in terms of using longitudinal data to help identify these baselines for individuals, and when we're observing a change perhaps from that kind of baseline.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because in terms of longitudinal data and what we would need in order to be able to do that is something worth considering. So, for example, if we see people's mental health as a state that changes fairly often, and in response to events that they encounter in the real world, which then get reflected kind of in their mood and the way they present on social media, how long would you need to kind of measure someone's longitudinal mental health and social media states to be kind of feel certain that you have an understanding of what their baseline is? And it's a question that I think is coming up more now that we have the technology to be able to gather those insights. So, for example, ecological momentary assessment is becoming more and more popular, which is a way of assessing someone's, anything that you'd like. You ask them questions several times a day or once a day for quite a long time, and that's a way to gather data that you can then use to longitudinally understand how someone is feeling or behaving. And I think as we see more of those technologies being used, and especially with social media data, or even alongside electronic health records and things like that, that will give us more opportunities to be able to get a really good understanding of those baselines. Because if we're taking a point, so if someone is surveyed once a year and we have one mental health measure of some kind, or even two concurrently once a year, can we really use that as a baseline and say on that particular day, this is just the way that person was feeling, and we're going to use that as an absolute baseline for how they behave the rest of the time? And I think that's questionable whether we can do that. Maybe that's the data that we have right now and that's what we can do, but in the future we should probably aspire to do more than that.
Thank you. And I wanted to also ask, what are your thoughts in terms of selecting data for analysis and annotation? So assuming that we are able to, and I think that links also to this question about the longitudinal data and how much of a person's kind of timeline should we look at. So what are your thoughts on sort of sampling data for analysis and annotation?
Yeah, so in terms of, you could see it in a few different ways. So in terms of actually building data sets in order to create models from which we'd use for prediction, it's a good question, because feasibly, and again, I'll speak to my experience, which is mostly with Twitter, you could collect up to 3,000 of someone's previous tweets. And a common way of annotating that data is to say, okay, well, if in any of those tweets they've somewhere said, I feel depressed, or I am depressed, or I have depression, then that's a positive label for depression, and you can use that to annotate the data set with. But again, the reliability of using that as a label and as kind of ground truth for mental health is something that we have to think about. So if someone said that a year ago, how do we know that the data that we're training it on that might be coming through now is still relevant to what they said back then? And so I think part of the problem of using social media data in particular is that we don't have a good understanding of the present state of how people are feeling and the people who are actually creating that data. And most of the time we don't have the opportunity to actually ask them in real life, because that data is being collected almost passively in a way that doesn't give us the opportunity to go back to those people and actually talk to them about how they are feeling. But in some ways that also can apply to other types of data. So we might use GPs' diagnoses as an example of ground truth in mental health data. But we also know that there are kind of systemic biases in GP data, like diagnoses. So they'll consistently, people from Black or minoritized backgrounds are underdiagnosed with mental health conditions. So things like that, even then, can we really be certain about the labels that we're using? Something to think about.
Thank you very much, Nina. So we'll move over to Sumitra. And Sumitra has worked both with social media data, but also very importantly with electronic health record data. And so it would be really nice to hear about the sort of the differences in working with the two types of data, both in terms of modeling considerations, but also in terms of sort of reliability and obviously the difference in granularity. So over to you, Sumitra.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks, Nina and Lucia. So it's interesting coming from a computational side and trying to do useful things for these really hard questions. Like you say, Nina, mental health is a really broad topic too, and we're as computer scientists trying to do something useful, but it's huge, and so we need to also drill it down to something that's actually doable, and we need to be pragmatic and understand, well, we need to get data for it, and we need to be understanding of what these data sources actually do give us, and what that means in what we're trying to model. So having now worked a lot on electronic health record data, and especially from the mental health domain in the UK, it's interesting to see how from an annotation perspective, and as was mentioned as a topic also, and how to actually sample examples for different things is not as trivial as you would think. So I think one of the key things we need to be much more aware of as technical researchers using these things is also the context of the data. I think that was alluded to by both Nina and Lucia, in that people, when using social media, use them differently in different contexts, and that's something that we should know also when developing our annotation models. And similarly with electronic health records, there's a huge context to how these are written and documented, and why and when in the healthcare process. And that's been something we've had to think a lot about, especially for one project where we were trying to identify things like symptom onset in patients with a particular diagnosis, and not assuming that that information is just documented, you know, at one certain point or in one certain way. It's something that's assessed in a kind of context that we need to be aware of in our data collection as well. Another thing to remember is the fact that electronic health records are written by clinicians and healthcare practitioners, so they are giving a third-person account of a patient. So the implications of the models for the patient perspective is something we need to also be careful about, how that's interpreted and how that's combined with any analysis using social media instead, where it's actually the person and the first-person account that is giving the information of interest. And I'm so far not aware of too many studies where that is linked, and that where, you know, the assumptions that have been made in the annotations for each of the data sources, how well they actually map to the concept that we're trying to actually model. And that's something I'd be really interested in seeing more work in. But as was said too by both previous panelists, it's also, there's ethical implications, there's a lot of implications in doing this kind of research, and so there's a lot to be looked at before. I hope that makes sense.
Sure. So I was wondering what your thoughts are in terms of how we can better combine information that we have from electronic health records and social media data. So I know that the KCL group has also done some work recently on so you know, how trends we see in social media manifest, you know, coincide with what we see in terms of incidents in electronic health records. So yeah, if you can tell us a bit more about how the two can be combined, and also I guess also in cases where we can actually align individuals for whom we have information in EHR and obviously and social media data.
Yeah, right. So yeah, it's, again, from a research kind of program perspective, it requires a lot of preparations in terms of making sure that participants consent to that kind of research, and agree to sharing the work or their posts in social media and that kind of thing. Once that agreement is in place, there are ways of kind of linking those two data sources, and that's a really interesting way of trying to capture the interest, you know, the interlink between the two data sources. One thing to remember, I guess, too, as was also said, in terms of social media, we don't really know the population, and what we do know with electronic health record data is the population. We know they're seen by health services, they've been referred to and all that, but that also gives us a limitation, because there's a lot of people out there who don't have access to these health services, and they will never really be captured in any models using electronic health record data. So it's a balance in trying to get a good a good or an appropriate sample for whichever research question you might be working on. But I think combining electronic health record data and social media data is a really interesting avenue, I think, to understanding this link in also in our annotation models, how they actually map then to each other.
Thank you very much, Sumitra. We might come back to that if we have time. So next, I'd like to ask Susie. So Susie, as the co-founder of Me2, has a different perspective. So everyone we've spoken to so far is a researcher and sort of at the intersection of NLP and mental health. And Susie is actually a stakeholder in this sense. So she would benefit from these technologies. And of course, she's also, her app is collecting such data from individuals, and they're also annotating the data. So I think it would be great to hear from Susie in terms of a little bit more about Me2 and how, so far with the data you collect, how easy it is to distinguish between the different problems that young people are facing and identifying a ground truth. So Susie, over to you. I think you need to unmute yourself, Susie.
Yeah, okay. Everything that's been said so far is really fascinating, because we are coming at it from a completely different perspective. And in many ways, I think we're probably doing quite a lot of the things that you're trying to model. We're already doing them in practice. The app was essentially set up to help young people to help each other, so the peer support model, because of all the evidence there is to support that. And we put lots of safeguarding features in place to protect them, so that the whole moderation thing was really around safeguarding. But what we then began to realize was that the way that we were capturing the data, the way that we were tagging it and risk assessing it in order to pick up the high risk users, was creating this really unique data set where we can map longitudinal change, and we can see how young people get better, get worse. We also, the other reason why moderators were so important was because of this issue of context. Because machine learning can't differentiate between somebody saying I want to die and somebody saying, oh my god, I want to die. It's the same words, but it's a different context. And we do have those issues in trying to differentiate, and that is a human decision. How high risk is this based on these words being used? The other thing that we started doing is looking at how our moderators are tagging. So using machine learning to look at how to bring in terms of code tagging the different posts. So they might use 4 or more tags out of a possible 200. But you'll find that some moderators favor some tags. Some moderators, their pattern will be to, extend through the entire 200, whereas others, you'll see clusters around certain tags. So we know that there's already some bias in our data, and we are introducing machine learning to suggest the tags so that the moderator it'll be easier for them to tag it, and then hopefully we'll be able to iron out some of that kind of human bias as such. But in terms of what we see, in terms of what is mental health is life. Every single thing that these young people experience has the potential to impact the way they feel. And so the number one issue is always friendship. Interesting, isn't it, that that's the thing that it seems like such a small thing, and if you try and find support resources around that issue, it's quite difficult to find them. So okay, in the last 3 months the number one issue is coronavirus, but really it's their relationships and how those relationships make them feel that has a huge impact on them. The other thing I would say is that it's all very well tying up with medical records, but we also see firsthand from these users that they don't tell the truth to doctors or to therapists. They withhold information. They say what they think people want them to say. So again, you know, that has to be looked at in terms of bias as well. I'll stop now. Oh,
Thank
I
you.
can't hear you. Okay.
Oh, so it was me forgetting to unmute. So that's fantastic. I was also wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about so this issue of, well, how much data do we need to know to identify the baseline of an individual? This was also discussed earlier. So how do we you know, how do you feel that the moderators you know, get to know an individual essentially and work best? So if there are any wisdom to share on this, if there's any wisdom.
I mean, the app, it looks and feels like social media, but it's not social media. So it's 350 character posts. That also makes it much easier. So it forces the young people to get to the nub of the problem, so they can't kind of waffle on, but it also makes it much easier to kind of extract meaning from the posts. It's not designed to be used long term, so we use it when they feel bad or feel like they need some support, and then they might use it for a 3-month period and then they'll stop using it. But we have patterns of data over periods of years for these users who keep returning. And so what that gives us is a really holistic understanding of their whole life. So we can see what's going on with their family, what's going on with their friends, what's going on at school when they're reaching crisis point. We can also see patterns of change. One thing that I see over and over again is how when young people try and control issues in their life that are making them feel out of control, that they will experience anxiety and distress and depression, and then very often we will see an eating disorder creep in as they hit crisis point. We can definitely see those patterns over hundreds, if not thousands of users, and they're the kind of things that we feel would be really helpful in terms of establishing predictive models. So, you know, we have this information. We don't yet have the capacity to understand it in the ways that it could be understood, and that's, you know, where we definitely want to move to now.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So I'd like now to hear from our last panelist, Bo Wang. And Bo, you've been working quite a lot with multimodal data for mental health, especially in the case where we have clinical therapy sessions or non-therapy sessions, but sort of conversations with a clinician. So kind of one-to-one sessions, and you've been looking at understanding mood patterns and emotion patterns in this kind of setting. Would you like to tell us about the challenges in working with multimodal data for mental health, and also particular challenges in establishing the ground truth for emotions across different modalities?
Right. Yes. There are a few questions here. The first one is multimodal. How to build multimodal learning. Yeah, it's not easy task because you have for some modalities you have less low frequency data such as EHRs, and which you want to combine with other data sources. For example, sensor data, which is much higher frequency. So you have to align the two, doing some kind of multimodal, multi-scale learning. Make sure that the data sources, the data modalities are complementary to each other. But it's a learning problem. so it can be solved. So your second question is related to emotions and the ground truth of with regard to emotions, right? Yeah. So here this has something to do with the representations of the emotions. They are, as far as I know, 3 types of representations, emotional representations you can select from. One is a categorical representation of emotions. So this theory dates back to the Darwin perspective of basic emotions. So this is a biologically fixed, universal across all humans. I guess the most well-known one here is the six Ekman emotions found in facial expressions, and we now have more complex emotions now, in which some we know are culturally influenced and constructed. And back in 2017, there was a study identified 27 emotions by examining over 2,000 short videos evoking certain types of emotions. So that's one type, and the next type of representation is dimensional representation of emotions. The most popular one here is the two-dimensional representation between arousal and balance, or the 3-dimensional representation between balance, arousal, and dominance. This multi-dimensional representation really allows us to describe emotional intensity over time. And lastly, the last representation is the ordinal representation of emotions, which has order, but there's no notion of distance between labels. But there are studies reporting this approach actually to be rather effective. But here, you want to ask pairwise comparative questions like, do you find this person in this video to be more sad or angry than that person in that video? So these are the some representations of emotions you might want to consider which one you want to use. You might want to use all of them during your emotional annotation task. Just want to mention a couple things you might want to consider. One is that so there is a reaction lag between emotional content and your annotation. So this is more to do with the time series, the time continuous annotations, the dimensional and representation of emotions. So this is something that you want to consider. You might want to align the two when you are doing the modeling as a pre-processing of your data. Another thing is really more important point is the ambiguities in emotion representations. So there are ambiguities. We know there are ambiguities in experienced emotions, expressed emotions, and the perceived emotions between the speaker and the perceiver. So one example here is a good example is the inter-annotator agreement. You might want to treat in your inter-annotator agreements as features in emotion recognition. So from problem formulation until the evaluation. So this is not something that we usually do as a machine learner or data scientist, but in this context, because the very subjective nature of emotion, not just emotions really, but other subjective ground truth, is that you want to consider this not as a noise, but as a feature. and that's it really. But last point is the time scale of emotions. There are different time scales: word level, sentence level, utterance level, speaker turn level, and as well as the time continuous annotations. So this is another thing you want to consider in terms of the ground truth or the annotations of your emotions.
Great, thank you both. So both as someone who has consumed such annotations, and also you've had to also annotate data, what do you think is sort of the most difficult issue? Is it the sort of the not having annotations at a fine-grained enough level? Mm-hmm. Is it that you don't have enough data, and so over-labeling is not helpful? What have been the issues that you've encountered?
I think most of the issues that I have experienced are really data issues. Especially for clinical data, we usually have a very small data set to work with. So we're constrained by the size here and there's the approaches we can use. Having said that, there are different pre-training, cross-learning methods we can use. There are large pre-trained models we can utilize from. But I mean, the bigger size, data with regard to data, if we can get hold of larger data sets, that's definitely an improvement. And another is different types of data. Really, we also start building large scale multimodal longitudinal data sets across all types of people. So that's including the underrepresented populations mentioned by Lucia earlier. So this is we're not only talking about environmental measures, lifestyle, but also biological as well. We know there's a lot of things we can say about you by your genetics. So we also have that as well. So there are a few, and you mentioned earlier that we want to have a baseline for each person. But some more ambitious goals here are, can we have a baseline for a group of people, or if not globally? So these are very ambitious questions that probably deserve ambitious projects. And so this project Baseline by Verily, which is a sister company of Google, they are currently collecting such data from different sources over time. So that's not only a self-report, but also your mobile data, your voice, and so on, across a large group of people. And there's another program by National Institute of Health in the States called All of Us, and they are collecting such data as well across a large group of people, your genetics, and also your EHRs and sensor data and so on. So the challenges are really to have better data, to have a larger data, but also we need better science as well. We need better neuroscience. Otherwise, we know that the current, if we're talking about mental disorders here, the diagnosis ought to be the clinicians' diagnosis, so the real experts here. But we know that our current diagnostic system is evolving story, and DSM-4 had around 400 labels, and 10 years later, DSM-5 had, I think, currently has over 500 labels now. So we need a better sense as well.
Great, thank you very much, Bo. So would any of the panelists like to say anything as a sort of take-home message in terms of next steps also in addition to the things that Bo mentioned. Okay, no?
Well, I guess one thing to take home is that it's great to see that there's more awareness of these limitations with the approaches that have been used up until now, and that there's more discussion around how to improve that, and how to actually convey what these models actually do and what they don't do. More importantly, I think is potentially one thing to summarize points with.
I just want to add one more point for like future studies or the trend. So right now the ethical studies in this field is still lacking. There are not many ethical studies to look at how likely people are willing to contribute their data to research in terms of using a model to monitor their mental health and their behavior on social media. So there were like 1 or 2 recent studies which found that lots of people, they support, more than 60% of the participants, they do support using this kind of technology to monitor their behavior, depression. But a lot of people, like more than half of them, are against the idea that their social media data is being used. And more than 80% against the idea that it's being used without consent. So we need more of these kind of studies in the future to see how people's comfortable level, and see how can we move forward this kind of studies.
I agree. This is really important in this space, and also in terms of what we do. I mean, even with people who say, "Well, I'm happy to share my data," how would we make sure that the models that we then produced are not going to be used against individuals? So I think that's quite an interesting prospect. So if you're you have some piece of software that monitors your mental health and can tell you, oh, you probably are reaching a point where you need to get some help. We don't want companies using that against their own employees, for example. So there are definitely ethical issues in terms of how we safely apply these kinds of technology. And I know that Becky also has a panel later on ethics. So hopefully many can join this as well.
Yeah, just one more sentence. The funny part is, like, most of the people, they don't feel comfortable for an algorithm to detect their social media behavior, but they feel more uncomfortable of a real person to scan through their data and tell them whether they have depression or not. So this is an interesting thing. That means that technology might compensate some of the issues in here.
I think actually what we see is that when young people are in crisis, they will do anything to get the support that they need. So what we do is we share their data back to them in a format that they can then use to take to a clinician or a therapist. So they are given the agency, it's their choice, and they can share it. But in our experience, it's so difficult for them to get appropriate clinical help, or to get to CAMHS, or to get assessed, that anything that you can give them that will make that process easier or more manageable, they are very keen on. I think when you think about data sharing, you must think about giving the agency to the young person, or to the person whose data it is, and not sharing it anonymously with medical experts. But if you give them the choice and you give them the power, then it can be a really powerful and helpful thing for them.